Hey fellow Trek Chatters, I'm Pit Trekkie, and welcome to another episode of Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. For today's episode, what I'm going to be doing is talking about a special episode that occurred in Star Trek, in the fandom, many years ago. And it was a special episode for many different reasons, which I will be getting into in this episode. But the episode I'm talking about is the third season finale of Star Trek The Next Generation, The Best of Both Worlds. Now, there were a lot of different reasons why this episode was very unique, going from it being the first Star Trek cliffhanger that happened to all the talk that went around all around the world about what was going to happen in Part 2, and just the characters, what happened to Picard, a whole bunch of different things made this episode very unique. I'll be honest with you, I love this episode. And that's the reason why I'm doing this episode, because actually this month, June of 2025, is the 35th anniversary of the original airing of this episode. By the way, that episode is actually the oldest episode that I still have recorded on VHS from it being a brand new episode. We actually recorded it that day. And I will never forget that day. I was 9 years old. I had just finished 3rd grade a couple weeks ago. And I remember watching a week earlier the preview, and that was really interesting because it was saying like Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3 about what they were going to do. And of course I remember the Borg from Q Who, so it was very exciting the thought that we were actually going to see them again and see what this episode was going to bring and what was going to happen with the Borg in this episode. I remember it was a bright sunny day. I was watching it with my dad and my 2 brothers because my mom was working at the time. And I remember being shocked at the end because I'm like, this is it? This is the end of the episode? And I remember we had to pick my mom up at 9 o'clock at night from a drugstore where she was working as her second job. And I remember being so excited to tell Mom, you got to come home, we got to rewatch it. And so we brought her home and we watched it all together again. And some really good memories from that. So I can't believe it's been 35 years already. It just feels like it was like 10 years ago to some degree. I mean, it's just... time's blurring and going so fast, you know? So, really what I want to talk a little bit about is a little history of the episode, and I want to kind of talk about my thoughts on how important this episode really is to Star Trek fandom. So really, the basic history of this episode, Michael Piller had joined the Next Generation during its 3rd season as a writer, kind of producing things of that nature, and he said in different articles that he had said that he had wanted to bring the Borg into the 3rd season but never really understood how to do it. And he had been thinking about different ideas throughout the entire 3rd season and nothing really kind of panned out until he started thinking about, with the producers, well, maybe we need to have a queen, some sort of voice that would actually be able to kind of personalize the Borg, somebody to talk to. And of course Michael Piller didn't think that was necessarily a good idea to have a queen because, you know, it was interesting that the Borg were basically this faceless enemy. So what ended up happening is he rejected that idea, but as he thought about it up toward the end of the season, he said, what if Picard becomes the voice? And that's when they all agreed that would be a very interesting way to end this season. Now, it's pretty well established that the Next Generation's tone shifted basically by the time the 3rd season hit. The first couple of seasons had some good episodes, but it just didn't feel like an emotional depth or maturity. And Michael Piller's credited for bringing a lot of that in along with some of the other writers that came in around that time in Season 3. And you can even see the tone change in the episodes for Season 3. There was a lot more drama and emotion and depth that a lot of the episodes in Seasons 1 and 2 didn't have. So Michael Piller actually was only signed on for the Next Generation for a year. So when this episode blew up and turned into like this big, like, what's going to happen next, he was surprised, and then that's kind of what led for him to stay on throughout basically the rest of the series. So what I want to talk about is, I really do believe, in my opinion, this episode is the best episode of Star Trek that was ever written. And that's quite a lot to say, because we've had a lot of really good Star Trek episodes. We've had The City on the Edge of Forever from the original series. The Next Generation, 2 seasons later, had The Inner Light. Deep Space Nine had In the Pale Moonlight. It had a lot of different... There were some other ones I'm just not thinking about right now, but there have been a lot of good ones. So how... Originally I was going to do this episode is I'm saying this is why it's the best Star Trek episode ever. And I retooled it a little bit because I'm saying to myself, who am I to say what the best episode of Star Trek is? So I'm going to give my opinion on why I think this episode is the best. I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I believe The Best of Both Worlds is the best episode of Star Trek ever made. Alright? So, the first reason that I would say that it's the best one is because it had such a strong, impactful story. If you think about it, all of the Federation was at risk here, not just humanity. I mean, a lot of times it seemed like, obviously the Borg were going to Sector 001 to assimilate Earth and humanity, and Locutus was made to be that voice that bridged the gap between humanity and the Borg. But, obviously, the Federation is made up of 150 different planets at this point. So, obviously going after Earth made sense first because that's where everything was kind of headquartered. In Paris and in San Francisco. So that makes logical sense, but all these other races, eventually they would have all been assimilated as well. I believe a resistance would have happened, but there definitely would have been some sort, it would have just spread out to where eventually the Federation would have been completely wiped out. And then by extension, what happens after that? The Klingons could have been assimilated, the Cardassians, the Romulans, maybe the Ferengi, I don't know, possibly. You know, who knows whatever else could have been assimilated at that time. So it was not just Earth and humanity, it was the entire Federation, and by extension, the Alpha and Beta Quadrants could have ended up being completely assimilated. Now we already know certain pieces of situations were assimilated by the Borg up to that point. We know that in the first season finale of Next Generation, the Neutral Zone, that the Borg had scooped up a Romulan colony or whatever, and I assume would have assimilated them. I mean, it makes sense. And it was how they knew in Q Who that it was the Borg actually did that, because they saw something that had also happened in System J25, and then we saw it in The Best of Both Worlds when they got rid of the Jure 4 New Providence colony. So that was it. By extension, everything was at risk at this point in this story. Okay? Riker and Shelby obviously had a big role in this story. So the episode started pretty much where Riker was given command of the USS Melbourne if he wanted it. But again, for the 3rd time in a row, he decided, oh, I want to stay on the Enterprise. It's too great a risk. I'd rather just be first officer. And this was a little bit of a change for Riker, because Riker was always the one in the first couple of seasons that went for the action and was in charge. He always led the away teams where Picard stayed on board the ship, and he was very adamant about that. You know, so we know that he was offered a command of the Arsenal of Freedom in Season 1. We found out that he had been offered the command of the ship. I can't remember the name. But he had that offered, and then a year later he was offered a command in the Icarus Factor, and he turned that down as well. Originally he wasn't going to, but then he decided he wanted to stay with the Enterprise. So this is the 3rd time that he said no. And by then it seemed like he was starting to get a little bit complacent, but he didn't realize. In comes Shelby, who's this big hot shot who's trying to help them figure out stuff with the Borg, but she's very gung-ho and headstrong. And it's not that she was arrogant or anything per se, it's just she had a lot of ambition and she wanted to rise up in the ranks. And that was a threat to Riker. And she kind of made that threat known right away, because she asked him in her quarters, you know, I said basically, I'm going to let Captain Picard know I'm the right person for your job. And that rubbed him the wrong way, and I think that's where it started to change the relationship. And he even talks about this with Counselor Troy in 10 Forward. Why am I staying here? Why am I playing it safe? She tries reassuring him that he's actually grown and has done well, and he'll do what's best for his career and what's right, but that there's really nothing wrong. He's perfectly fine the way he is at this point. All right? Also, another part of what made this story very impactful was, well, Picard had kind of 2 different things going on here. Or actually a couple of things. So if you think about it, Picard's trying to help Riker deal with his about wanting to stay on board the Enterprise and trying to kick him out of the nest, essentially. So at the beginning of the episode, it didn't focus on much like a Picard story. But then about, I'd say, halfway through the episode when the Enterprise is in the Paulson Nebula and he's walking through the ship, there's a weight weighing on Picard right there that we had never really seen before with him in any of the other episodes. He's walking through the ship watching his crew do what they have to do to get prepared for the imminent attack that they know was coming with the Borg. But it's really also weighing on Picard's shoulders. Not only is my ship and my crew at risk here, but also the fate of the Federation could possibly be in my hands right now based on the decisions we make. And he actually goes in and talks to Guinan, who is one of the few survivors of the Elorian race that had been essentially annihilated by the Borg. And she's the one who's actually trying to calm him down, saying that this isn't the end, this isn't the final page of humanity's history, and then turn the page. That no matter what, humanity is going to make it through this, no matter how it turns out, they're going to prevail, even if it takes a millennium, as Guinan said. But humanity will survive. Okay? Then you go on, and then the Enterprise escapes the nebula, the Borg catch up with them, and they kidnap Picard, okay, which you're not expecting this because this was mostly a Riker story. And then we find out Picard gets basically violated and assimilated into the Borg collective, being forced to be the voice for the Borg with humanity. And it was amazing to watch such a Riker-centered story that had nuggets of Picard in it. All of a sudden, Picard becomes a big focus of this episode, and what's going to happen to him. So the question is okay, if Picard's going to be assimilated, in the next part of this, who's going to be next? At this point, are we going to lose any more characters? How far is this storyline going to go as we go into the new season? So it left a lot of questions. Now, speaking of Riker and Picard, this really was a very flipped kind of story, which is another reason why I feel this episode is the best episode of Star Trek ever made. Because it's very unique. It starts out as a Riker story. He goes down to the New Providence colony. With the away team, we found out the colony has been destroyed. We find out that he's going to be working with Shelby to try to figure out how to defeat the Borg now that they're in Federation space. And, you see snippets of Picard. Again, you see where he's talking to Admiral Hansen about how Riker would end up being a great captain. And he realizes he needs to have a talk with Riker about kicking him out. But while you're watching this episode, the whole up to that point, the first half of the episode is basically a Riker story, getting jealous and threatened essentially by Shelby wanting to step all over him, and how she's so gung-ho, and how that's really kind of hitting his ego and getting him to self-reflect a little bit about himself. All right? Then out of nowhere, Picard gets kidnapped, so this is a big part of Picard taking over Riker's story, but in the process of Picard being kidnapped, it again becomes a Riker story, even though Picard's been kidnapped, because now he's forced into command. He has to make sure that the Enterprise, the crew is taken care of, while at the same time he rescues Picard, and he takes the Enterprise to Sector 001 to try to stop the Borg from taking over the Federation. And it shows a big shift in Riker basically being put in his place at this point. Shelby wants to lead the away team to go over and get Picard, but at the same time, Riker's like, hell no, absolutely not. And I think that was twofold. One, again, is ego, because it's like Shelby wants to show him up, but at the same time, this was his captain. And right now, this was his crew. He wanted to get his captain back, not realizing that, oh my goodness, I'm in command now. Now I'm in the place where I've put Picard for the last 3 years. And it takes Counselor Troy to basically politely tell him off and say, no, you know what? It's inappropriate for you to lead the away team. Until the return of Captain Picard, you're in command of the Enterprise. We're in a state of war, and your place is on the bridge. And he finally realized he didn't like it. You could see it in his face. He was like, oh, crap, she's right. I can't be a hypocrite. I got to sit down and protect my crew, and I got to let Shelby now be the one who saves Picard. Okay? So that was very, very difficult for him. Then the episode where the big focus is of them rescuing Picard, and then the away team realizes, oh my goodness, Picard's been assimilated. So now again, it becomes a big piece of Picard, but again, it goes back to how's it going to affect Riker moving forward. Now at this point, Wesley and Geordi have already talked about using the main deflector dish as a weapon to destroy the Borg ship because that's the only part of the Enterprise that can really generate enough energy to actually destroy the ship rather than the phasers and photon torpedoes. So now Riker's got a decision to make. Okay, he finds out that Picard has been assimilated, that by the away team tells him this, and now he has to figure out, what are we going to do? The Borg ship's going to be capable of warp any minute. They were able to slow the ship down by shooting the power nodes or whatever conduits in the ship. So eventually they get hailed by the Borg. Riker takes the message, and here comes Picard as Locutus saying that the Federation is going to be assimilated and you're going to service us. And then that's where Riker has to make a decision in basically a split second. Do I let the Borg go, or now that but they have Picard on the ship, how can I destroy it? And that's what made the cliffhanger so amazing, was him saying, Mr. Worf, fire. And that's where the episode ends, because you don't know what's going to happen, and you have to wait 3 months to find out. So could you imagine Riker in that position, where the Borg are about to finish regenerating their ship, and they're going to actually be going to Earth, possibly. They have a chance to stop them, but now he has to worry because Picard's been assimilated. And now what are we going to do? We can't kill Captain Picard. But in that moment, he realizes he has to do what he has to do, and literally he was going to sacrifice Picard for the rest of the good of the Federation. So it was a very heavy episode, but it was so interesting how it was mostly a Riker story, but Picard had his own little nuggets in the story, but the audience didn't even realize until he was assimilated, oh my goodness, you know what this is going to do for the rest of the episode. And then it focuses on what's Riker going to do. Okay? So this was a total shock, and that's what made the episode so special. Alrighty? The third thing that I really think helped make this one of the best episodes of Star Trek ever, it wasn't even the story, it was the haunting music score. This was a very unique musical score that was created by composer Ron Jones. And it had very unique Borgish kind of music, and they even used a synthetic choir in the episode in places to make the episode even more emotional and give the audience a stronger reaction. So that is one way of making an episode memorable, is to add that music. Think of episodes that have had their own special music for them, such as The Inner Light, how important of an episode that was, and how the music was so instrumental, especially the Russican flute theme. That was key, and that's what helps to make that episode special. This episode did not have music that you could have just fit into any other episode. And most of the other shows, up to this point, you could just swap out the music and it really wouldn't seem to matter. Okay, so, Heart of Glory was another one that has some unique Klingon-sounding kind of music, which made the episode unique. How about Booby Trap from earlier in the Next Generation's 3rd season? That episode with the Promelian battleship being 1,000 years old, and made it seem mystical and you know, just, you were in awe of it, because, wow, this 1,000-year-old ship. So music does play a strong role. Okay, so what also made this music special is because it was so special and so unique, the music for Best of Both Worlds Parts 1 and 2 were released on a CD in 1991, and then re-released in an extended CD by GNP Crescendo Records in 2013. All right. Also, in my opinion, the best part of the music for this episode was after Riker said fire, and then the To Be Continued came on. I remember in that point, when the To Be Continued came on, I said to my dad, I said, is it going to be next week that we get to watch the episode? This is where I learned what a cliffhanger was. When he told me, no, it won't be back until the fall. You know, some shows end where they have a story and you have to wait till the next season. I remember my 9-year-old self being so upset and so frustrated by it. I mean, I wasn't like bawling or throwing a tantrum. I was just like, oh man, why do I have to wait? And boy, that was a crazy summer to have to wait. And I know that I'm not alone in that. I know all of you who were alive at that time were like, come on, end of September, get here. You know, because it was just so, like, we wanted more. All right? That then takes us to the fourth reason why I think this was the best episode of Star Trek ever made. The effects that the episode had on future Star Trek projects. All right? What people don't realize is that this became a trilogy of episodes. So you ended Season 3 with the Best of Both Worlds. You start Season 4 out with the Best of Both Worlds Part 2. And then you had a third episode that didn't ignore what just happened. It finished it up. It was the episode Family, where Picard goes home to try to deal with the trauma from being assimilated by the Borg and what they forced him to do. So you never had that kind of continuity, per se, like a trilogy of episodes before, up to that point. Up to that point, you just had the original series in the beginning up to season 4 of Next Gen. Now you had the trilogy, the Genesis trilogy of movies for the original series. That was unique as well. Okay, but this, we actually got to see the aftermath of what happened in other episodes, which never really happened before in Star Trek. So this was special and unique. Obviously, after Family, they had to move on to other basic stories. Okay, but it gave closure to that arc and created a new depth to Picard that continued on, not just through the rest of the Next Generation, but into the Next Generation movies and Picard itself. All right, think about it. Later on in season 4, this got brought up again in the Drumhead. Admiral Nora Seti actually used that against Picard, telling him about how he destroyed 39 Federation starships at the cost of nearly 11,000 lives. At one point, you could actually see, he puts his head in his hand like this, like, can you imagine trying to relive that trauma? I mean, I'm a therapist in my real life, and I see what PTSD does to people. Can you imagine being re-traumatized like that, and in front of other people, in front of members of your own crew? That would just be awful, but you could see the damage that did for him. Jump ahead a year later to season 5 with Borg, and they rescue Hugh, and Geordi and Dr. Crusher are basically humanizing him by giving him a name and feeling sympathy for him, and you got Picard getting really angry and upset because he knows what the Borg are and what they're actually capable of. And at one point, Guinan actually goes to see Hugh and actually starts to feel for him as well, which is odd, and she tries to tell Picard about that, and Picard gets pissed off and says, "It's not a person, damn it, it's a Borg." You know, and then she says, if you're going to use this person to destroy his entire race, you want to at least face him once and think about what you're doing. That got Picard to actually think, and so he tried to stay tough and tried to be Locutus at one point, and actually started talking to Hugh, and when he started seeing Hugh being more individualized and saying "I," he sat back and said to himself, this plan that we have to set him up to destroy the rest of the Borg Collective, this is inhuman, this is inhumane. How can we do that even with a race of people that are trying to destroy us? Now that came back and haunted him again in the 6th season finale, Descent Part 1, where we find out Hugh actually did cause a lot of Borg to become individualized and separated from the collective. And basically now he's living a possible consequence of the decision that he made to show humanity to Hugh, and by extension the Borg itself, by not destroying them. Now they've got these individualized Borg who are going around killing people and destroying Federation colonies, you know, and my choice added to this. So now I've got all this trauma, what I did as Locutus, but now because of a choice I finally ultimately made, now more innocent civilians are being destroyed. So the effect is just of that, of Best of Both Worlds, just kept going on and on. Okay? Then eventually that led to First Contact, where we find out Picard can still hear the collective, and he can kind of know and sense what's going on with the Borg cube that's attacking Earth, and then when the Borg sphere goes back in time, and he still has that connection to the Borg. And you can see that he's still very traumatized by what happened in the Best of Both Worlds as Locutus, and how hard and difficult that was, and how basically he wanted to go and destroy the Borg once and for all, because they used them. They used him to destroy his own race and basically try to destroy the Federation. Now they're trying to destroy humanity's past. He had had enough. He wanted revenge. And, you know, Starfleet officers at that time aren't really into, you know, all of that. They've evolved past that. And here's that hardcore revenge coming out that shows that humanity can still revert back to its basic, you know, primal qualities when you're faced with a trauma that somebody else has caused, or something that you've gone through. Okay, and he was able to, he even seemed to have some sort of sympathy for the Borg Queen at the end. He and Data kind of talked about how they felt bad almost that she was dead because she was unique, you know. Then we really didn't have anything more with the Borg about that till the end of Picard Season 3. So we find out that Picard, obviously, we find out that he actually, the ability that he had to still stay connected to the collective was because he was implanted with some sort of, like, reverberator changed up DNA, Borg DNA essentially, which he ended up passing on to Jack through the genetics. And we find out through these genetics that Jack was actually able to hear the collective as well, even though he didn't really understand what all that was. He just thought he was kind of going crazy, and he was able to manipulate like certain minds, things like that. Well, we find out because he had that DNA passed on from Picard, and that's how he was able to hear the Borg Queen, and he ended up going to Jupiter, and she was able to manipulate him into becoming Vox. Now, the interesting thing about Locutus and Vox, they were both primed to be the voice of humanity in relation to tying them with the Borg. So Locutus was supposed to be kind of an equal or a counterpart to the Borg Queen. And actually that's why she named him Locutus, because in Latin, Locutus means one who speaks. And that was also why it's interesting that she had Jack. It was the son of Locutus, essentially, at this point. So she had the next generation, little joke there, next generation of Locutus, who can now be her new voice, because she's at this point, after what Voyager did in their series finale by decimating the Borg, the Queen is decrepit, falling apart, just a shell of what she was, and so is the collective. So, but she wants Jack to be her new counterpart, her new voice, and that's why she named him Vox, because Vox in Latin means voice. All right. Luckily, Picard was able to get through to his son and bring him back to his humanity, unassimilate him, essentially. The Borg were defeated, and he went back to living his life and served on the Enterprise G. Okay, so all of that Picard focus ties together a lot of the Star Trek canon. That's why I think this is such an important episode. Also, I can't leave this part out. Look at what Picard as Locutus at Wolf 359 did to Captain Shaw when he was just some lowly lieutenant or whatever on board the ship, some dipshit from Chicago, he says. You know, there's a lot of trauma and PTSD, and you can still see a lot of the visceral anger and shaking that he had from the trauma of being one of the few survivors that got to be selected to evacuate the ship, and how that still carries with him into his command of the Titan A. Even towards 7 and 9, just because she was a Borg. She had nothing to do with Wolf 359, but just the fact that she was a Borg was enough for him to not trust her, not feel comfortable around her. Heck, he wouldn't even call her by her preferred name. 7 and 9, it was Commander Hansen. You know, which eventually we find out later on, as he was dying, he referred to her for the first time as Commander 7, and actually showed a little bit of respect for her at that point. So the last reason why I think this episode was the most important best Star Trek episode ever made was not only just the impact that what the whole Picard thing did, but the historical impact on the Star Trek franchise itself. Not just the shows, but just like the fandom. So this was the first cliffhanger, like I said earlier, that Star Trek ever had. All right. This episode also got the fans buzzing, and this was before the internet, so they were basically writing into Star Trek, the official fan club magazine at the time, you know, what's going to happen, or writing into Starlog or Cinefantastique or whatever else was out there at the time. Everybody was debating what's going to happen to Picard. Is he going to survive Riker trying to destroy the Borg ship? Is he going to make it to Earth? Is he going to destroy humanity or assimilate humanity? Is Patrick Stewart going to leave the series? There was a lot of rumor going around that he had grown either tired of playing Picard or just didn't want to do it anymore. So Jonathan Frakes was going to be promoted to captain, and Shelby was going to come in as the first officer, as a new character, as a regular. So there was a lot of like, is that going to happen? Is that not going to happen? So there was debate in the fandom, which it probably had never been to that extreme before, ever, you know, because there was a lot of debate what was going to happen. All right. Also, the critical praise. There was a lot of critical praise for this episode. So going back, I'm going to mention a couple, but back in July 1st of 1996, TV Guide actually ranked the episode as number 50 in TV Guide's 100 most memorable moments in TV history. Not just Star Trek history, but TV history. Now, during Star Trek's 30th anniversary, TV Guide also rated the episode as 8 out of 10 of the top 10 Star Trek episodes ever made. In 2016, fast forwarding a little bit, this is the impact the episode still had. The Washington Post referred to this episode as, quote, the greatest cliffhanger in television history. And by then it was, what, 25, 26 years old? So, I mean, all those years later, a quarter of a century later, it was still getting strong accolades. It also, at the time, when it aired also won 2 Emmy Awards. Outstanding Art Direction for a Series and Outstanding Sound Editing for a Series. So, again, it wasn't because of the story, unfortunately. It was because of all the effects and the sounds and everything, which is great. That's fine. You know, even though I do think personally that thing should have won an Emmy, especially after the way Patrick Stewart and Jonathan Frakes acted in that episode. All right. Also, back in April of 2013, Paramount, or CBS at the time, was actually getting ready to release the 3rd season of The Next Generation on Blu-ray. So what they did to promote it was they did, on April 25th of 2013, for one night only in US and Canada, the episode, the 2-part of Best of Both Worlds 1 and 2 were both released as one big movie into theaters. I missed that. I don't know how I could have missed that, but I did. And but that shows again the staying power of this episode, how important it was. You have this almost 25-year-old episode at that point being reconfigured, put in HD, and then put on the movie screens. I mean, I don't know if many other episodes have really done that. I'm not sure. Tell me if they did. I don't think so. But I know they did Redemption and released that on Blu-ray as a special release. But I don't know if it was ever in theaters or not. But Best of Both Worlds got re-released into theaters for fans, which was amazing. All right? So those are the 5 reasons why I believe the Best of Both Worlds is the best episode of Star Trek that was ever produced. So I'm sure a lot of fans have other beliefs on that. That's fine. That's why I wanted to do this as an opinion piece rather than an actual, this is the reality, this is true. So please let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments section below. I'd love to have a little positive debate with all of you about this, what your thoughts are. Obviously, if you want to watch past episodes of Pittsburgh's Trek Chat, you can just go on to yahoo.com, type Pittsburgh's Trek Chat into the search engine. You can follow the show on Facebook, facebook.com/Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. You can also follow the show on X at PGH Trek Chat. I'm looking forward to the next episode. Until then, may yins live long and prosper.